Good afternoon. I want to let you know that we are recording this. Welcome to Showing Up for Kids. Conversations aren't showing up for kids. I'm Tim Markle. I'm the director of the Southern Regional Center for Children and Youth with Special Healthcare Needs. We cover 14 counties in southern and southwest Wisconsin. The conversations aren't showing up for kids is our way to try to engage parents and professionals in conversations that matter for children who have special healthcare needs. The guests who are here are not here as paid professionals. We are having a discussion. We are not medical professionals. We are not legal professionals. None of us are, I believe, are acting as an attorney. If any of the guests decide that they do want to act as an attorney, please let me know. If any of you want to act like a doctor, please let me know, because then there's separate disclaimers for people that are pretending to be something they're not. Now, if you actually are a lawyer and you want to give legal advice, put your name and number in the chat box so we can have people contact you. But until then, what we're doing is we're having a conversation. And I'm so excited for today's conversation. We're going to be talking about what to do when you disagree with your IEP team. IEP, for people who may not know, is the individualized education plan, and each child who is in special education have an IEP. And the IEP team meets, and parents are part of that IEP team, and sometimes things just don't go as well as they could. So I've invited some people today to help us understand what are options when that conflict happens, because conflict will happen. We're dealing with humans. We're going to get into conflict with other humans. So I just wanted to let the people introduce themselves first, and then we'll just get started with the conversation. Matthew, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Matthew Zellmer. I'm the Parent Services Coordinator for Wisconsin FACETS. In short form, FACETS is kind of the IEP process people, and we also do a heavy dose of special education themed training to assist parents and those who support them, as well as youth and self-advocates with the special education and transition processes.
Fantastic. And Matthew is being joined today by Gia.
Hello all, my name is Gia Pionek. I am the mediation partner and system administrator of the Wisconsin Special Education Mediation System, WSEMS for short. WSEMS is a system that is impartial. It was started by families, special education directors, and mediators to try and help families resolve disputes in a way short of other avenues that they might have. So it's a place where the families and districts can all share their voice and try and come up with unique solutions for their particular student and child.
Thank you, Gia. That was a very good elevator speech. You did very well with that. That was in a nutshell what the mediation system is. I want to start with Matthew. Now, Matthew, I said that conflict sometimes seems inevitable because we deal with people and people sometimes disagree. So, what would you, if you get a call from a family who say, we just had an IEP team meeting and I don't necessarily agree with everything that's going on, but I'm not sure what to do about it. What sort of options does that family have if they disagree on what the IEP team, even though they're part of the team, what the IEP team wants to do?
Well,
do you ever get those calls?
Yeah. In fact, we joke at the office that we don't know how to get the types of calls that parents just decide to contact someone because they're so excited that things are going so well at their child's school. So you more or less describe the intro to most any call we can get on what we call our help desk, which is essentially myself and one other main individual that are tasked with, after calls are transferred to the help desk person, diving into the IEP related issues that typically a parent is calling about. So if they say, I have issues ABC, sometimes they don't offer that they just had an IEP meeting. So a common question I'll ask is the last one that they had. And if it is very recent, I might cover other logistics such as, well, what roles were present in the IEP meeting, such as was the special ed director present or pupil services person present, because going up the chain of command is one of those things that we often encourage parents to do, both for open communication purposes, and oftentimes because, quite frankly, going up the chain of command is necessary because in order to ultimately find a solution, parents need to have the decision maker for the district in the room, that person who can commit various resources, because usually these things involve, committing more or different district resources to, meeting the special education students' needs. Sometimes the disagreement could just revolve around something wasn't quite heard the way it was intended, or it's an inartful way of expressing some point being made during a meeting. And
Sure.
most of these calls, of course, we've not been in the IEP meeting, so we kind of have to do some probing to get to the bottom of that. But there are informal and then more formal ways, of dealing with disagreement with your child's school, which of course we'll get to later. But we always start at the informal levels, finding out, what's going on locally, and highly encouraging solutions be found between the parents and school and or district, so that we don't resort to formal dispute resolution options, right away, for a lot of reasons, one of which is scarce resources of the system. Also,
Right.
as our staff, we have way more calls and possible requests than we can say yes to. Our work
Yeah.
is much more than sitting by phones waiting to be invited to IEP meetings. So the more we can do upfront on the phone with the provision of resources about parent rights, options, including potential dispute resolution up front, hopefully before these things happen. But
Mm-hmm.
depending on the point in time that the parent has contacted us, that may not always be possible. So every call is different. We kind of just work through the situation as presented by the parent, and most calls include follow-up emails with resources that can be helpful to them as far as next steps. And if there is a disagreement, then we kind of continue on up the chain of command, or the step ladder of sorts of dispute resolution.
I like the step ladder of, I'm glad you didn't call it a 2-story lift. I much prefer to think of it as a step ladder of conflict resolution, that
As
things
a
are
wheelchair
within reach.
user, I'm not a huge fan of 2-story structures.
I don't blame you. I've yet to see a very well-designed 2-story ramp for an entrance into a building. I've not come across it. Want to ask you a couple of follow-ups to see if there's some things to try to cut off conflict before it happens in an IEP meeting, IEP team meeting. So what you're saying is, so should every IEP team meeting have a decision maker from the school district as part of that meeting?
Yes, it is legally required that the school have what's called an LEA, which stands for Local Education Agency. In plain English, it means the LEA is the person who has the authority to make decisions on behalf of the school or district, who can commit resources, both human and financial if necessary, to the commitments that are in the IEP, which we should preface everything by saying, though we are not attorneys, the IEP is very much a legal document in nature.
Yes.
So that LEA does have the authority to make decisions on behalf of the school or district. Not to say it doesn't happen where a question is posed and the parent has a request in which the sitting LEA is not the highest possible person up the chain.
Yeah.
So it does come back from time to time that, okay, I will check with, essentially their supervisor, and that can happen if it's not the director that's present in the meeting, but that LEA, it's important for parents to know prior to a meeting, or ask if they don't know even as the meeting starts, who's serving in that LEA role, because it can
Yeah.
be anybody that's had the training to be one. It should not be the same person as is running the meeting as the designated special ed teacher, or many places would call it an IEP case manager. And I think the reasons for that are pretty clear. It needs to be a team with different voices and different types of expertise. It can be a building principal, it can be a school psychologist, particularly if you're in an evaluation phase. It can be that special ed director. It can be a number of roles, but it should not also be the teacher who is also the primary author of the IEP document.
So there should be an LEA in each IEP as we continue to throw out acronyms, which I love doing. It's just kind of fun. It makes me feel very professional to be in the know of all the acronyms. It's really fun. So an LEA in the IEP. So if a parent is arriving and doesn't really know who the LEA is, they can ask who is serving as the LEA, who is serving as the district or school decision maker. And if there isn't one in the meeting, can the parents say, you know what, then this isn't really an IEP meeting, let's reschedule?
Yes.
They have the right to, parents have the right to do that?
Yes, and they should do exactly that. I have been in meetings where an LEA was found, if it was determined
Do they
that
hide?
a principal was in another meeting and could not commit to this one as originally planned. So that is, while it does satisfy the requirement, less than ideal, because there's a chance then that that person might not be involved at all with what goes on day to day with this student. So yes, a parent absolutely can ask, should ask, and if there is no LEA, they have the right to say this isn't an official IEP meeting and we need to reconvene when all the roles can be present. If it's a situation in which the IEP is quote unquote expiring, as in the end date of the previous is in a day or two, that's a problem. So that would be the situation where, you know, somebody like me is most likely to say, whether present or not, you know, they just better do their level best to find one. We've got a bit of a problem here.
Yeah, so that's just one of those things that can help resolve conflict before it starts. Because without that LEA, my understanding is that there really can't be a decision on those resources to be allocated to the student. And so what you don't want is a situation where you're in the IEP meeting and everybody comes up with these great ideas, but nothing can get implemented until it gets shot up the food chain. And that leaves nobody feeling good. So one of the things to resolve conflict before it helps is make sure that all the partners are there.
And the easiest way really to find out who the LEA is, and this is just good on general parent-friendly principles, is to do introductions, you know, when everybody's around the table, or in this case, the screen, you know, who's who and what role are you playing in the meeting. So the person who is the LEA should say, I'm the principal at, you know, high school X, and I'm going to be serving as the LEA today.
And so with the LEA and the special educators around the table, maybe a school psychologist, you might have this parent who's arriving and feeling very outnumbered and feeling like they're not going to be able to keep track of everything. So who can the parents bring with them to help them keep track of what's going on in the IEP meeting?
That's a great question, because we at FACETS, for example, we do have a limited capacity among our team to attend IEP meetings, whether it be in the flesh, virtually, on the phone, whatever means of technology are being used. Many of our help desk calls do start right away with, hi, I'm looking for a parent advocate to attend an IEP meeting with me. Our resources are scarce, so that's why we place such an emphasis on diving as deep as we can into the issues and concerns over the phone and prepping the parent, you know, almost in live time for the upcoming IEP meeting. And then that's where the follow-up comes in, with one of our many, many special education resources. And these are all things that are out there in the public domain. I think just contacting somebody like us or another parent support organization, some of which I know will be subjects and guests of future conversations as such. So I'm not going to steal any of those people's thunder. But the more we do up front, the better prepared we think the parent will be. Sometimes we, after diving deeply into the issues and providing those things, we hear something that's particularly compelling. So in a certain sense, we do have priority issues such as, a shortened school day for behavioral reasons, something that we hear is, mediation worthy, which will then explain the system. And, Gia then takes over for her bit, which we'll get to shortly. But there's all kind of ways that we do that. The other thing I would say, Tim, is that I do get the calls from the parents who are essentially panicked because they say things like, there's 6 of them and there's 1 of me.
Yeah.
I need a body there to balance the scales. I hear that, but our presence alone doesn't change the outcome of the meeting. And when we talk about being an IEP team and equal partners and making decisions and reaching consensus, very rarely does anything happen during a meeting where a decision is made by a show of hands. So this is not a democratic process for making decisions. It's this general idea of consensus, which does not mean that everyone has to agree. So quite often, there will be a decision or two, hopefully isolated, when we look at the whole process and the whole legal document that the parent might not be totally on board with or confident is the right thing. But basically, if we can get, a very good plan which meets the prioritized needs of the child as determined for us by the parent, then that's a good outcome. But if there continues to be an impasse, that's where more formal dispute resolutions come in.
So what I hear you saying is that on select circumstances, depending on staffing and the topic, is FACETS may be able to provide an advocate, but in most cases not. But that parent still has the option or right to bring along another parent.
Yeah, you can
or somebody to support them during that meeting.
Yep, I'm sorry, Tim. You can bring another parent. I've had, parents bringing me that'll bring that family member basically for moral support. You can bring anybody with a vested interest in the child's success. You can bring a private therapist that has particular expertise for those that may be linked up with county waiver programs. Those case managers are relatively often in this day and age present in IEP meetings. I don't recommend, bringing the next door neighbor for moral support if, when given the opportunity to talk, they're going to say things like, well, my grandma was a teacher 40 years ago and she said this. Vested interest in the child's success is good, but just make sure your support people are trusted and they won't get the train off the tracks.
See, and these are all great ideas and suggestions before we even get to finishing up the meeting where there may be a disagreement on the outcome. So let's move ahead to, we've had the IEP meeting and it just didn't go as we wanted to. One of the things that I heard you say was the informal solutions. What I've heard other parents say is that they found it really valuable to find a champion in that school that isn't necessarily the special ed director or the principal, but it's someone that they can talk to that can help them understand the culture of the school, that can help them understand better how to talk with the school. Have you had any parents who've talked about finding that champion or finding just somebody in the school that they can talk to as a resource when they hit times of conflict?
Absolutely, I have, and fairly often if they basically say that they don't have that person, I'm the one asking questions and encouraging them to find that person and maybe helping determine a little bit who that might be, is that it gets into an interesting area of IEP team dynamics. And
Yes.
sometimes where things start to break down is parents will have a good, solid relationship with the child's teacher. Maybe it's a teacher's aide, it could be someone else, but that relationship will happen privately, and that school person will say things that they then won't say in the meeting because their boss is present, or if it's an aide, they're not usually in the IEP meeting. So I actually, when it comes up, I sometimes find myself discouraging that support person being an official voice, because if that person is then lobbied by the parent to come into the IEP meeting, that could actually get them in hot water with their employer.
Oh, yeah.
Which ultimately does a further disservice to the student. But having that champion in the school is very important, and that's based on relationships and rapport and trust that's established over time. So what's harder, Tim, is to define what that champion looks like. It almost becomes, if you've got some period of years where this person has known this student, you sort of know it when you see it and hear it. It's not like you have a list, with all these bullet points saying, okay, this is my index on identifying my champion at school. You just kind of, through your relationships, get to know, hopefully, who that person can be.
And I love that term, relationships. I could talk for a long time about the importance of establishing relationships and how it looks different for each family. But that goes into family engagement, which we'll cover later on in the conversation series. So let's say that person has found a champion, and you talked about the other informal ways is then maybe they go and they have a meeting alone with the principal to try to be heard. A lot of time what I hear from parents is just, it's not that they're really mad about the outcome. They just don't feel they were heard. They just don't feel like they were listened to. And so sometimes sitting down and explaining that informally to a principal or director of special education might be able to move past the conflict. At least am I in a Pollyanna world with that, or is that a possibility?
No, because again, quite often, depending on what they're telling me, I'm the one encouraging that type of stuff over the phone, probably more often for the issues we hear with the special ed staff to some degree, or if it's the director that needs to be looped in on something, then it's that. If it's more of a behavioral issue or focusing in on that area, then maybe the principal would be an appropriate person to engage with, because at the end of the day, principals are not there to focus on special education. Their job is to, among other things, maintain discipline and order for all students in their building, as well as do all of their data collection and reporting and the other not so fun things that we know they do. Sometimes principals have a special education background before they become principals. So if the parent knows this or is able to find that out, then I would look at that a little differently. But it depends on what the issue is. But in my world, no educator, really worth their salt, when approached diplomatically by a parent expressing a concern, won't be able to find time in some kind of way to talk with that parent if they really care about the welfare of the students in their school.
Matthew, I really like talking to you because you bring up so many different topics that I want to talk about if I get to continue to do conversations on showing up for kids. This has been a wonderful conversation about sort of the ideas of who to talk to, but you just brought up the whole sense that we're not talking about today, because I want to get Gia into this conversation, but the whole sense of how do I approach my school? How do I talk? How do I communicate? Are there better ways to communicate? So that's, again, a future conversation that I find really fascinating and really interesting. But we've been talking about the informal options. There are some formal options for dispute resolution that are in place. And that's where we wanted to talk to Gia with the Wisconsin Special Education Mediation System. Is mediation is one of those options, and I really don't think a lot of parents know that it exists. I don't even know if a lot of districts know that it exists. So Gia, would you like to tell us a little bit about the system and how parents should access or why they would want to access the system?
Sure. So our system, our system has been around for over 20 years. And what we're here to do is we're here to help the parties, and I say parties meaning families and districts, sit down and potentially have a conversation about their disputes. And so let's talk about mediation first. Mediation is a process by which parties can sit down and have a conversation. The conversation is confidential. And so what is said in the room in mediation stays in the room, right? And so that often gives folks the liberty to talk more candidly or come brainstorm up with solutions that potentially they don't feel comfortable doing in maybe an IEP meeting, right? And so it gives them a little more freedom, and it offers an opportunity to do more relationship building, because sometimes the issues aren't just about, you mentioned earlier, Matthew, I think, mentioned families not feeling heard in an IEP meeting. So these are things that can be topics that people discuss in mediation. It could be something like, maybe they want to discuss placement, maybe they want to discuss communication plan or trust building. Those are all things that a mediator can help with. A mediator is a person who is impartial. They're not a judge. They're not going to give advice. They're not a therapist. Some of our folks on our roster do have backgrounds in law or, special education or other areas that that serve them well in a former career, but their role in the room is to be an impartial dispute resolution expert. So they're there to offer their skills as a dispute resolution expert. So oftentimes when I talk to families on the phone or districts, they just say, I just want someone to tell us what's right. That's not going to happen in our system.
No,
I mean,
it's not mediation.
No, and so the individual, the mediator on who the parties choose, they're not going to say, okay, this is how I'm going to solve it. The parties will work very hard to come up with a very unique situation for the student and child, right? And there is the philosophy behind it is that the individuals who are engaged and know most about the student are the ones that know best about how to solve the student, like how the best course of action for the student. And someone from the outside doesn't know that. So we trust that the parties have that wisdom within them to make those decisions. Our roster we have about 20 mediators on our roster right now, and they're trained in dispute resolution. And some of them have other backgrounds that lend itself to dispute resolution in this area of special education. And so we are offering at this time both virtual, our primary is virtual mediations at this point. And there also is in-person, though when we are holding in-person mediations, they are following CDC guidelines and local state regulations, whatever they might be at the time of the mediation, which could change, right? By the time you have it. So that's the general platform. I should also mention that there's no cost to either parents or districts. This is a free system. And additionally, it's voluntary. So you can't, as a district, you can't force a family to go to mediation, and the family can't force a district to go to mediation. We're hopeful that the parties will agree to go to mediation and help come together and come in a spirit of creativity and compromise. Like, how can we resolve this dispute? Even if it's for the immediate future and not forever and ever, it's something we can do in the immediate future to help make things better. That's our goal.
Yeah, take that next step. Help that family, help that child get to the next step. We're not going to solve the next 18 years, but let's try to get through the school year. So does there have to be a level of conflict? Like, does the family or the dispute have to be like code red before they can contact the mediation system? Or when is appropriate for a parent to find you guys and learn more about if mediation would be an option?
Well, they can contact me directly at any time, whether or not mediation makes sense. We recommend all the steps that Matthew talked about. Those are all steps that we would recommend people discuss first. But if for anyone who's interested in learning more about the system, you can go to our website, which is wsems.us. My contact information is directly on the website. And so my email's there. There's a toll-free line. And then there's lots of great information about videos that, talk about the different options that we offer, and more information about how we can serve families and districts. So it doesn't have to be a code red. And in fact,
Okay.
It's better when it's not a code red, because a lot of times what we find is that communication is oftentimes a central role or central part of the dispute itself. And that's always easier to solve earlier on versus farther along. So rather than letting it kind of build and build and build, where people are no longer feeling like they're working in partnership with their schools and have stress and anxiety, we're there to help. It's easier for us to serve both parties better when it's earlier on.
And it's one of those things that I really wanted to make sure that people understood, is because I'm sometimes afraid that I frame it in such a sense that you need to go through 17 informal opportunities before you get into mediation. And that's just not true. Is that the mediators are there to help find that consensus that Matthew was talking about. Is that the meetings are supposed to be, we all agree that this is what is best for that child. And sometimes it just helps to have an unbiased third party to talk that through. So it's good to know that you don't have to wait for the code red or the I'm never talking to my school ever again. Mediation may not be the best option at that point because the relationship is too good. So while there's still a relationship, it seems mediation is a good option. So who helps parents decide whether mediation is a good option?
Well, they can, a few different ways they can find out. So sometimes they find out through advocacy organizations like Matthew's, right? And they talk through what is mediation, and sometimes they talk directly with me, and we'll talk about what's going on and discuss how, if mediation seems like a good fit. Sometimes we get referrals from DPI where there's a complaint that's been filed and they suggest to the parent or school that they try mediation first to see if they can come up with their own resolution. Or sometimes it's been other family or, however folks find out. So we're open to spreading the word of how for folks to learn more about the mediation system any way we can.
Awesome. And so now I want to ask that, a tough question that we may not be able to answer today, or we may not. So we've talked about all the sort of informal things that families can take and that districts can take. And we've talked about mediation that, we're just not, for some reason, what I'm saying is not being heard. And what you're saying, I'm not understanding. And so then in that case, a mediator may be able to figure out how to get the two parties to understand each other and talk to each other. But sometimes that doesn't even happen. So if families are finding that they can't come to a consensus with their IEP team, are there options that are out there that families can take to try to move beyond that? And that's the question that we may not be able to answer today.
Well,
I may not have. Sometimes I don't have the right people on the call.
I was waiting if you were setting me up or Gia up to answer. So I guess I'll just take the floor for a moment. So a couple of things. One, my job first and foremost at the help desk level exists to not even make Gia's role and mediation services necessary, if at all possible. She's too kind. She gets a lot of paperwork dropped in her lap because of me. So there is that, but she's also maybe a little modest because we get no benefit at FACETS from sending cases to mediation or successful mediations beyond what happens for the family and child. But the system at last data check is producing in excess of 90% rates of agreement when a case does go to mediation. Now, as to the question you asked, that's a bit of the gloom and doom, because for us, mediation is the highest level of support, if you will, the most intensive meeting that we can actually participate in. There are other options, but from our perspective, none of them are really great. They don't paint a rosy outlook and a likelihood of success for families. Due process hearing is something that happens that functions like a mini trial, so we can only give general information that they have that right, and maybe supply a parent with the form for convenience sake, if that's the direction they want to go in. And then, of course, you always have the right to go to court, but all of the other things that we've discussed exist to not have that happen. And if families have to lawyer up and figure out how they're going to afford all of these things, there isn't much we can do. We do have a list of attorneys that we on occasion will provide to families through FACETS. That's not an endorsement of their work or their services. It just simply means that we put out a call when putting the list together, and those attorneys have agreed to be on the list. So mediation is our highest level, and then if it fails and the fight needs to continue, we have to say that we are legitimately, sincerely sorry, but we've come to the end of our road. So the options following mediation, I'm going to exclude a DPI complaint from my answer, because as you sort of alluded to, that can happen simultaneously at times. But beyond mediation and then the DPI complaint process, the remaining options are of a legal nature.
Anything to add to that, Gia?
As my role as the system administrator is to remain impartial, so I refrain from discussing second and options beyond that. But
thank you. And my understanding from my position is exactly as Matthew was stating, is that the people that I meet in the system are trying their best to solve the conflict before it gets to even the level of filing a complaint with DPI, which is a family's right to do. But again, what it's showing to me is that the school and the family aren't listening to each other, is that there's some sort of broken relationship. And I am just such a believer in relationships that I have this hope that there could be some sort of consensus and resolution, which is why I really appreciate all the informal suggestions and then mediation as one of those options. Because as we then continue in, it just gets harder, it gets more expensive, it breaks the relationships even further. And so those are steps that proceed with caution. Whereas everything up to that, of having those discussions and going into mediation, is one of those things of we just want to try to reach consensus. Let's use all the tools we can to come to an agreement, to come to consensus. I want to take a moment. We do have some live people that have joined us today on the conversation. So just want to open up if you have any questions for Matthew or for Gia. Please feel free to put them in the chat box and I will reiterate them, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. If we have radio silence for more than 5 seconds, I will get nervous and we'll start to talk about anything whatsoever. So thankfully, we have someone who is technology savvy and has put in the chat box they don't have questions, so that I don't have to continue to endure silence. So I guess I'll give you each a chance if you have anything else that you would like to add before we close out today. Matthew, any sort of closing thoughts?
Well, with everything we've talked about, mostly the informal options, we believe in parents as the experts on their child first and foremost, which is why we tell them that no matter the amount of work that we do or the years of experience our team may have, that they will remain the experts. And that's why, in addition to not being legal services, we are not decision makers for the family in any process. But we have been proud for 20 some years to be founding partners and continuing partners in the mediation system. And many states have gone on to use Wisconsin's special ed mediation system as their own exemplar. So for everybody out there who is unsure about whether mediation could be the right step for them in resolving a dispute with school, beyond the cliche of you don't know till you try, it really does work, because I'll take a 90% rate of agreement any day I can get it after some of the fights I hear that parents have had for years and years with their schools.
Thank you, Matthew. Gia, anything that you would like to say in closing?
Sure. Well, thank you for hosting this. I appreciate it, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss WSEMS. One thing I would like to have people think about is that, you know, they may be anxious about contacting us or discussing mediation, but think about the anxiety that you might be living with day to day by having this ongoing conflict with you know, at the school and with the family. And what would happen? What would life be like if that conflict could disappear? What would it be like to have a really great relationship with your school? And so that might be the result of mediation, and that might be a reason why, in and of itself, why you want to contact us and keep building those good relationships with the school.
Well, thank you. And I will make sure for those people that are watching this on our YouTube channel, in the description we will have the websites for Wisconsin FACETS, so you know how to contact them and their phone number, along with the Special Education Mediation System. And then, of course, the Wisconsin Regional Centers. If you're not sure what's out there as a resource, you're not sure who you want to talk to, you can call your regional center and they will help you figure out who it is you need to get in touch with. I know we rely at the Southern Regional Center on Wisconsin FACETS as one of those resources for our parents, not just because they're helpline, but as Matthew said, they also offer a huge number of trainings throughout the year to help you better navigate the education system. A lot of their trainings are over the phone, they're free. I just would recommend that if you're looking to try to find more information about the special education system, is that feel free to see the training that Wisconsin FACETS can be offering. With that, again, just want to say thank you. Let you guys know that I'm going to formally end this conversation and we're going to end the recording, but please stay on the line just for a couple minutes after so I can offer you my personal thanks. I hope everybody has a great day. Stay safe, stay well.